listening to this last panel, but listening to all the voices today and last evening, an image started to come in my mind. And this image, of course, expressed in the very beautiful words of a Palestinian poet. And I say this, if Sylvia and Irela are in the room, I'm going to offer this poem for them. It's translated from Arabic, and it goes like, share with me an attention to the drunkenness of light, the light of the butterfly, in the blackness of this tunnel. I heard you, Leslie, but I say the poem. And listening deeply and thanking Jen for bringing this gathering of women together, we must continue to walk towards the sun, claiming the sky. You know, when you come from my part of the world, it's easy to say that I must have been a storyteller in my last life. And I'm thinking of one, and I think particularly of Jeanette, who touched me deeply in her presentation, of the little story that was told Rabindranath Tagore, and you know him surely, and his work, on the riches of the poor. This is a story of women. It's a story about the gift imaginary. This was a time of darkness. It was a time of, I learned something today from you. But this was a time of famine that was devastating the land of Shravasti. And the Lord Buddha, where all the people had gathered, the hungry people, the poor people, he looked at everybody and he said, who will feed these people? Who will care for these people? Who will take this task of feeding the hungry? He looked at the banker Ratnakar and he said to Ratnakar, what is your answer? Ratnakar, the banker, looked down and he said, but much more than all of my future is needed to feed those who are hungry. He then looked at Jaisen, who was the chief of the army, the king's chief. And Jaisen, of course, said, I would happily give you my life, but there is not enough food in my house. Dharampal, who possessed large pastures, sighed because he said, the god of the wind had dried out our fields, and I do not even know how to pay the king's taxes. Then somewhere in the gathering was Supriya. She was the beggar's daughter. And she raised her hand and she got up and she said, I will nourish these people. I will care for the people. Everybody was surprised and in consternation asked her, but how will you do this? How can you accomplish this wish of yours? And Supriya very gently told them, and she said, it is true that I am the poorest among you, but there is my strength, my treasure, and my affluence, because I will find them each, I will find all this at each one of your doors. We live, friends, in very violent times, difficult times, times in which the community and collective memories are dying, times in which our many dreams are turning into never-ending nightmares and the future increasingly fragmenting, times that are collapsing the many life visions into a single cosmology that has created its own universal truths of equality, development, peace, truths that are inherently discriminatory, even violent, times that have created a development model that has dispossessed the majority, that has desacralized nature, that has destroyed whole cultures and civilizations, that denigrates the women. Times in which globalization, a la Pax Americana, brings with it a time of violent uncertainty and of brutal wars. Times in which the dominant political thinking and political institutions and instruments of human rights are hardly able to address the violence that is not only escalating, but intensifying. Times in which progress presupposes the genocide of the many, times in which human rights have come to mean the rights of the powerful and the rights of the privileged, times in which the political space for the other is slowly diminishing, even closing. The world, it would seem, is at the end of its imagination. So I want to gather some stars. I want to make a fire here. So I go to the night sky and I bring this. And I want to tell you a story, because the story is of horror, but it is also of hope. It is a story so real, yet magical. It's about Argentina under the dictators. The hero, I usually tell stories of women and grandmothers and shamans and wise women. But this is a wise man. He's a hero, Carlos Rueda, who is an intense man. And he directs a children's theater and is at home in the world of children and theater. And during the time of the dictators, Carlos discovers that he has an extraordinary gift. He realizes that he can be the site, the locus, the vessel, if you like, for a dream. And he can narrate the fate of the missing. You know, Argentina during the time of the dictators. So from all over Argentina, men and women came to see him. And sitting in the garden, Carlos told them stories. He told them stories of torture, of hope, of death, of luck, stories about the missing. All around the house were birds, tropical in hope, each a memory of a lost friend. One day, the regime arrests his wife, Celia. For a courageous act of reporting, she's writing in the newspapers. The whole world of Carlos collapses, and he realizes that he must keep her alive in his imagination. Because Carlos realizes that it is only in the imagination, and it's only the imagination, that stands between us and fear. Fear makes us behave like sheep, when we should all be dreaming like poets. As the regime becomes more violent, it is the women who object. It is the women as wives, as mothers, as daughters who congregate in silence, and you all know the story, in the Plaza de Mayo. Quietly, silently, each carries a placard announcing and asking about the missing. This is the power of the powerless. The women walk quietly, sometimes holding hands. But this is not just an act of protest, friends. It is a whole drama of caring, each listening to the other's story, each assuring the other through touch, weaving a sense of community. People realize that we cannot be indifferent observers or spectators or bystanders or even experts. The indifference of the watchers to the spectacles of the regime will not do. One must be a witness, and a witness is not a mere spectator. She looks, but she also listens, and she remembers, because everything must be remembered. Everything must be recited, nothing must be forgotten. Every scream must be redeemed with a name. We must retrieve history by memory, from memory, and we must explore this new imaginary then, not as experts, but as witnesses. We live, it is true, in a world that is being uprooted, every day uprooted. And I often think that it is not knowledge of this that is lacking. The educated general public, people all over, in this day of all the kinds of technologies that we have in communication, people have always known what outrages have been committed in the name of development or in the name of progress, in the name of civilization, in the name of democracy, in the name of the market, and now today in the name of human rights and justice and freedom and enduring freedom. Everywhere in the world, where knowledge is being suppressed, knowledge that if it were made known would shatter our image of the world and force us to question ourselves. Everywhere, there, the heart of darkness is being enacted. We need then, friends, to find new imaginaries. We need an imaginary where people of the margins are subjects of their own history, writing their own cultural narratives, offering new universals, imagining a world in more life-enhancing terms, constructing a new radical imaginary. The new imaginary cannot have its moorings in the dominant discourse, but must seek to locate itself in a discourse of dissent that comes from a deep critique of the different forms of domination and violence in our times. Any new imaginary cannot be tied to the dominant discourse and systems of violence and exclusion. Our imaginaries must be different. This new cosmology will move away from the Eurocentric and androcentric methodologies which only observe and describe, methodologies which only quantify, percentify, classify, completely indifferent to phenomena which cannot be obtained or explained through its frames. We need to deconstruct the dominant mythology, disallowing the invasion of the dominant discourse, refusing the integration of the South, and I explain how I see the South, into the agenda of globalization. The new imaginary invites us to create a new spectrum of methods which depart from the linear mode of thought and perception to one that is more holistic, one that is more holographic. It urges us to seek more qualitative methodologies in oral history, in experiential analysis, in action research, in fluid categories, listening for those nuances, listening and searching for the shadow, in poetry, in myth, in metaphor, even in magic. The new imaginary invites us to a way of knowing that refuses to control nature. It is a way, and to exploit nature, to place these fragments, to discern an essence, to move into another space, another time, recapturing hidden knowledges, regenerating forgotten spaces, and refinding other cosmologies. I think many women that have spoken during this meeting are talking about the reconnecting and the refinding of other cosmologies, reweaving here the future. It is perhaps here that the notion of the sacred survives. It is here in the cosmologies and the rootedness of cultures, here with people on the peripheries, perhaps, that we must begin to speak, and we may see the beginnings of an alternative discourse. Our imaginaries must be different. We need to imagine alternative visions for change, to craft visions that will evolve out of the conversations across cultures, conversations that are not mediated by the hegemony of the universal discourse. The new imaginary invites us to another, and I just picked the human rights discourse. I could pick war or patriarchy. Let me take human rights, but one that will not be trapped either in the universalisms of the dominant discourse, tied as it is to a market economy, a monoculturalism, a materialist ethic, the politics and the polity of nation states. But neither must it be caught in the culture-specific, but one that will proffer universalisms that have been born out of a dialogue of civilizations. But this will mean even another ethic of dialogue. We need to find new perspectives on the universality of human rights in dialogue with other cultural perspectives of reality, other notions of development, of democracy, even dissent, other concepts of power and governance, other notions of equality, dignity, for instance, other concepts of justice, justice without revenge, a justice with a healing, because humankind proffers us many horizons of discourse. And just because our eyes do not as yet behold these horizons, it does not mean that these horizons do not exist. As the poet says, friends, we must now break that routine. But if I would just look at democracy, because democracy came up too many times, and the dominant understanding of this democracy is tied to a notion of individual rights, private property, the market economy. We are all equal, we are told, in political democracy. But this political democracy is tied to a market economy, and the market works as the guarantor of inequality, of unequal distribution, of how only a few will be rich and how the many must live below poverty lines. What shall we do with this rhetoric of political equality on which this democracy is built while the majority live without below the poverty lines, as I said. We must seek new concepts of democracy, but democracy then tied to notions of freedom that is different from that which is enshrined in the Enlightenment and its market. There is an urgent need to reinvent the political, to infuse the political with the ethical. And we've been talking about an ethic of care, an ethic of concern, an ethic of connectedness, an ethic of compassion, an ethic of community. I think of 1996, just to underline this point, of Madeleine Albright, which was then the Secretary of State. And somebody asked her what she felt about the 500,000 Iraqi children who had died as a result of the US economic sanctions. Was it a high price to pay, she was asked. She replied that it was a very hard choice, but yes, that's her quote, yes, all things considered, we think that the price was worth it. Lives of children lost in wars are considered collateral damage. In the world of rights, we are all equal. Each of us have a fundamental right to life. If I had time, I would have told you a little story now, but let me continue. Because we must break this routine, we must do even extravagant actions. Jen, an action like this, we have to continue, extravagant actions that will begin the decolonization of our imagination, that would change the course of history, that would change the logic of our development. What is essential is to go beyond the politics of violence and terror of the times and to find a new imagination, to sing our root song, to re-find the dream. The fire still burns, and I'm going to tell you another little story. So it's a story of women, and I want to weave that in, so it's some of my work also, which I offer you. It's not really my work, it's the work of many, many women that are involved in what we call the courts of women. It's a story of women located in the discourse of dissent, inspired by an imaginary offered by the new meaning of the South, which I'll come to. A little expression proffered in this new imaginary that we explore, not as expert, not as witness, not as a spectator, because a witness is not a spectator, who she looks and she also listens. She remembers so that nothing must be forgotten. The story of the Courts of Women is a dream of many years ago. It started with the women in the Asian Women's Human Rights Council and with several other women's groups and movements in different places, in Asia and the Pacific first, where we've held so far 9 courts. And we've encouraged more courts, worked with women in different regions in the world, mostly in the Third World, in Africa, in the Arab region, in the Arab world, and in Central America. We've held, as I said, about 20 courts so far. The Courts of Women, and that's what I really want to talk about, is the unfolding of this space. So many of the kinds of dreams that we have been talking about, we started the first court in 1992. It is the unfolding of a space, an imaginary, a horizon, that invites us in many ways to think, to feel, to dance and to dream, to challenge and to connect. It's an attempt to define a new space for women and to infuse this space with a new vision, a new politics. It is a gathering of voices and visions of the global South, locating itself in a discourse of dissent. In itself, it is a dislocating practice, challenging the new world order of globalization, crossing lines, breaking new ground, listening to the voices and movements in the margins. The Courts of Women, because it challenges the dominant knowledge paradigm, weaves together the objective, it is not one or the other, so it weaves together the objective reality through analysis of the issues with the subjective testimonies of the women, the rational with the intuitive, the personal with the political, the lyrical with the logical, the dancer with the dance, because you cannot separate the dancer from the dance. And urging us, inviting us to discern new insights, offering us other ways to know, inviting us to seek deeper layers of knowledge towards creating a new knowledge paradigm. The Courts of Women are public hearings, friends. the court is used in a very symbolic way. But then, you know, when you start to say the court of women, that's when it gets cheeky, okay? The court is used in a symbolic way. In the courts, the voices of the survivors are listened to, women bringing their personal testimonies of violence to the courts. The courts are sacred spaces where women speaking in a language of suffering, and this is very important, name the crimes, seeking redress, even reparation. The courts of women in this way is a rejection of the silencing of the violence. Silence, as we know, is the condition by which power maintains its ideological hold. Breaking the silence represents that point of disruption and of counter-hegemonic truth-telling. The courts of women are about truth-telling. In place of silence, the women speak truth to power, not compromise truth with power, but the women speak truth to power. In place of darkness, the women provide knowledge of violence and violations. I have to change that word. Huh? While the courts of women friends listen to the voices of the survivors, it also listens to the voices of women who resist, who rebel, who refuse to turn against their dreams. I'm going to jump a little. It speaks to a new generation of human rights, because the court of women also hears challenges to the dominant human rights discourse, whose frames have excluded the knowledges of women. They hear the courts repeatedly the need to extend the discourse and to challenge the basic premises on which the discourse is built, the ideological, the philosophical, and the historical moorings of the rights discourse, challenging it to include the meanings and symbols and perspectives and visions of women. It speaks then for a new generation of women's human rights. The courts of women legitimizes not only by dominant standards, but by claims to the truth. That is what legitimizes. Witnessing women reclaiming of voice and language, and it is the rejection that constitutes a contemporary resistance to the decolonization of our minds and of our imaginations. Our imaginations have been colonized, as we know, by the logic of the market, of profit-making, of self-interest. I heard that from you also when you spoke, of competition, of private property, and these times of globalization that further colonize our imagination. The courts of women invite us to write a counter-hegemonic history, a history from the margins, because it is a journey of the margins, a journey rather than an imagined destination. A journey in which the dailiness of life, and that's important, proffers possibilities for our imaginary, survival and sustenance, for connectedness and community. For the idea of an imaginary is inextricably linked to the personal, political, and historical. It is the dislocation expressed by particular social groups that makes possible the articulation of new imaginaries. These social groups on the margins, the global south, the south in the south, the south in the north, the indigenous, the blacks, the women, are beginning to articulate these new imaginaries. I must just go for a little while to say to you how we understand the South in the courts of women. The South, as we often express ourselves as third world, but also as, the third world is so much of an economic category, you know, the notion of catching up, the notion of progress. But the South is the cultures and civilizations of Asia, of Africa, of the Arab world, of Latin America. The South is the voices and movements of peoples, wherever these movements exist. The South is the visions and wisdoms of women. The South is the discovering of new paradigms which challenge the existing theoretical concepts and categories, breaking the mind constructs, seeking a new language to describe what it perceives, refusing the one objective, rational, scientific discourse and cosmology and worldview as the only worldview. The South is the discovery of other cosmologies, as the recovery of other knowledges that have been hidden, submerged, even silenced. The South then, as Michel Foucault spoke, of as the insurrection of these subjugated knowledges. The South is history, friends, but the South also is mystery. The South is the finding of new political paradigms, inventing new political patterns, creating alternative political imaginations. The South is the revelation of each civilization within its own idiom, and the South is conversations between the different cultures and civilizations. The South, then, as new universalisms. And I believe that in our searching for new universalisms of the South, it promises to bring to the world new meanings and also new moorings. It invites us to create a new imaginary, to birth a new cosmology. The South, then, as new political imaginary. The peasants in Chiapas, all of us know of the peasants in Chiapas, describing their new imaginary, explain their core vision in their struggle for their livelihoods and for their life worlds, and for retaining those life worlds. And in their profound and careful organization, in their political imagining and vision, they do not offer a clear, rigid, universal truths, knowing that the journey in itself is precious. They sum up their vision in these three little words: asking, we walk. The asking in itself challenges master narratives, masters' houses, houses of reason. Karina spoke about the master imaginary. Jen told us about the gift imaginary. But it's this asking in itself that challenges the universal truths of power and of politics. The courts of women invite us to dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde said this. I think I'm the third one who speaks of her poems. But Audre Lorde said that the master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. There is an urgent need to challenge the centralizing logic of the master's narrative, implicit to the dominant discourses of war, of patriarchy, of race, of the project for the new American century. This dominant logic is a logic of violence and exclusion. It is a logic of superior and inferior, a logic of civilized and uncivilized. I'm going to finish quickly now. You know, the part that I wanted really to share with you is the part, the Court of Women on the US war crimes. But I must leave that out because it will take me at least 10 or 15 minutes on that. So I'll just end this part of it, and then I'm sure everybody wants to ask you questions. The centralizing logic, friends, must be decentered. It must be interrupted, even disrupted. The courts of women speak to this disruption. It speaks to this trespass. Fatima Mernissi wrote a very beautiful book called The Dreams of Trespass, and that's what the courts of women are about. It is about crossing lines, and it is about listening to the wisdoms of the forest. The courts of women is a tribute to the human spirit in which testimonies can not only be heard but also legitimized. The courts provide the witnesses and survivors, not only validating their suffering, but also validating their hopes and dreams that they have dared to harbor. It speaks to the right of subjugated peoples to articulate the crimes against women, bringing new beginnings in political possibilities. It is taking away the legitimizing ideologies of domination and returning it into the hands of women. The courts of women are challenges to the imaginary, inviting us to a fuller unfolding of our imaginaries, a radically new way of looking at ourselves and others, a basic change of an ethical nature crucial for us to rediscover and to regain our humanity, knowing that another world must be possible, another worldview, as Jen says, is possible, and that the violence against women must become unthinkable. We need to find new spaces for our imagination, gathering the subjugated knowledges, seeking ancient wisdoms, but also infusing this with new visions, listening to the many voices from the margins speaking, but listening also to the many unspoken, remembering our roots, knowing our wisdoms, wisdoms that are written on the barks of trees, wisdoms that are written on our skins and the inside of our skins, searching for that river beneath the river. For a few moments, think that I'm Jen, okay? I'm going to speak for her because I found this very beautiful little poem of Chrysostom, and I think it's something that I want to say, but that's from Jen. And Jen, to all the others who work with Jen, to really the beautiful women that work with Jen, Sally and Liliana and Mary Nell and Bracken, I hope I don't forget anybody here, and Chicky and Jessie, because I want to say this to each one, and to Lavar and to Toby and to Sylvia, to all of you. If I've forgotten somebody, you're there in my heart. But I want to say this, and now I'm Jen, okay? And she's saying this to all of us. She says to all of us here, you have come gathering with me. You have made a circle with me. Each of you, from the places that I have wandered, I want to give you the first flower opening from the earth that I have sown. I want to give each of you that flower. I give you seeds for a new way. I give you the moon shining on a fire of singing women. I give you the sounds of our thoughts flying. I give you the sounds of our feet dancing. I give you the sounds of peace. Thank you for all the patience you have had to listen.
My bell, and it's down in the purse with everything else. I apologize. What I've done is, when there's a witch, there's a way. Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling. Okay. A prayer and then a pledge of allegiance. Here's the prayer. I will fly. I know barbed wire, thumbtacks, bear halls. I've seen the white walls of slavery, and I can transform them too. Each thing examined regains beauty. I will fly into color itself, red as the fiery robes of huge women, blue as the veins in her breasts, green as her hair trailing on the sea, purple as her most sacred self. I will fly like a plant flies, invisible in small seed pods, born on the friendly goddess wind, touching endless possibilities, someday deciding where to land, where to sprout, knowing I'll fly again. I'll be rich weighted by 100 flying women, gold flashes from their caring, and as they fly by my window, wearing images of the goddess next to their skin. I'll fly in a rising mist of desire. I'll touch the smoke, taste the wet air, fly above, fly below, infinite acrobats. I will fly, fly in dreams, fly working, break out of the shadow, flying, skywrite letters and invocations, fly lonely as purple dipping sun, or fly in crowds of beautiful women, or drift clinging to the long dress of the mother herself. I'll see as I fly, my eyes will fly. I am simple and splendid in flight. Like all natural things, a simple miracle, a woman in flight. Thanks to Jenny Yates. Our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the earth and to the flora, fauna, and human life that it supports. One planet indivisible, with safe air, water, and soil, economic justice, equal rights, and peace for all. Thanks to the Women's Environment and Development Organization of the Women's Foreign Policy Council. Thank you. Welcome to Las Vegas. Welcome to Nevada and this conference. I look forward to many of you visiting the temple also. The temple is a product of the gift economy. It's a gift to all that go to visit it. It was the greatest gift for me. Living the gift economy is very unique. When I was young, I always liked to, when I had nothing to do on Saturday, I'd go to the shopping areas and help the old women or the old men carry their groceries home. And people say, and I wouldn't take money, I didn't do it for tips. And people say, well, why are you doing that? What's in it for you? And the great thing being associated with the gift economy is they don't ask that. It has been so wonderful living the gift economy. We, at the temple, there's no membership, there's no dues. We don't pass the hat because we don't wear one. And we don't have a donation box. And people will say, you know, well, what if I want to donate? Well, if you want to give a gift, that's fine. Because it's also important, it's an important gift to give others of receiving. So when people offer me anything, I never say no. Even if I don't have a use for it, I know I'll find somebody who does. And this way, it's almost like the gift that keeps giving. If we deny some of those things, it's like all the gifts that the goddess or the creator has given us. To deny it would be like denying what our mother wants to give us. I could do weddings, twisting, hand fasting, legal weddings, and we would do all the rites of passage, and I also would give lessons, instructions, and there was never any charge for any of those things. And some of my colleagues or acquaintances in the area or from other places would say, oh, you've got to charge for that, or people won't appreciate it. And, you know, the answer is like, well, as soon as you put a fee on it, that's all it's worth. And so you can't charge for anything like that. And they say, well, for instructions, you have to charge them because they have to make a commitment. And it's a little over a ride, an hour ride from here to the temple. And anybody who's going to drive that distance has made a commitment. There is also a guest house there. And it sleeps about 12 people in beds. And it has all the conveniences, the kitchen, etc. And women from all over come and visit. And that's also a gift to the women. There's no charge for that. There's no fee. So it is kind of confusing for me coming back into the city to try and get, I got to pay for everything. But most of the things that I have been gifts from people visiting throughout. I would always, when people come to visit, if they weren't going to stay, I always serve tea and chocolate. That's what witches do. That's how you know. It has been a wonderful experience over all these years, and the hundreds and hundreds of women that I have met from all over, and how not only they appreciate the gift economy, but practice it also. Just want to pass one little thing on that I learned from somebody. No matter what your budget is, you can figure out a few dollars extra a week that you can carry around with you. I started this practice a while ago, and I use it for people who I see begging out in the street, the homeless. And so I have X amount of dollars that I can give to, so that when somebody comes up and is begging, you don't have to say no. You know, just a couple dollars here or a dollar there. And I learned this from a woman who was practicing the gift economy also. And I think it's a really great thing because you don't feel like you don't feel like you're being used, but you've got this special, this little extra that you got special for somebody who needs it. And I'd like to encourage people to do that. I will tell you real quick about how I got to be at the temple. When I moved to Las Vegas, I didn't know where I was going to live, and or what I was going to do. So I was doing a radio show for a while, but I wanted to move outside of the city. I wanted to be in the desert. And so there was a full moon, 1993. it was on Samhain, which is our special day, and it also was on a Sunday that the clocks got turned back. So it was a 25-hour day, full moon, and Samhain. 3 things. So I wrapped myself in a white sheet and went out under the moon and told the goddess, I want to live this life. I was coming out of the closet, the broom closet, and I want to be in this community and live it 25 hours a day. A year to the day is when I took over at the Goddess Temple. So, you know, we have the power to do things, put out that energy, and we can make changes. I want to just read a little quote from Sojourner Truth. She was speaking at the National Women's Suffrage Convention in 1852. And she said, if the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone, these together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. And the men, you better let them. And we have many crones. And don't forget the power of the crones. And banishing poverty, banishing some of the war. I'll be around for questions. I'm sorry that I'm not sure if I've clearly explained how the gift economy worked at the temple. And so I'll answer any questions that you have later. Thank you very much.
Well, I also would like to add to the chorus of thanks to Jen Vaughn and the network, the Feminist Economy Gift Network. I'm honored and really, really happy to be part of this historic conference. It feels as if something is coming together that I know so many of us have wanted for such a long time, some kind of integrated alignment with what we might have once called spiritual and feminist and political politics. I'm very thrilled to feel it in my gut coming together here and expressing itself in a powerful way. I guess I need to keep my finger on this button so I don't make them go backwards. Okay. The archetype of selfless or altruistic giving without attachment to outcome or any concept of reciprocity belongs originally and most fully to the goddess, the great mother of all things. The feminine force is active and life-producing, said Maria Gimbutas. Her body is parthenogenic, that is, creating life out of itself. Known scientifically as the Big Bang, her boundless creativity gave rise to the endless and diverse forms found in nature, whose beauty is impossible to replicate, and whose primary expression is unceasing, dynamic, cyclic growth, birth, death, and regeneration. This is first woman. Her labia are swollen, the Aboriginal women say, because she's so sexually active. I see first woman and the goddess as a great spider spinning the world from her center, reweaving the web of life again and again through eons and ages. This cyclic continuity should be enough to give us hope in our current situation, no matter how bad it gets. Since the first vulvas were inscribed on cave walls, and rock outcroppings tens of thousands of years ago, the female has been formally imaged as gift giver par excellence. The gift she gives of life and all that sustains it made a lasting impression on early humans coming to consciousness and beginning to express themselves through language and art. So-called Venus figures That's not a very good slide, but you know the Venus figures. From the Eurasian Paleolithic period, with their huge breasts and buttocks emphasized over any distinguishing personal features, demonstrate the acknowledged gift-giving capacity of the being that would later be called the Great Mother, Mother Earth, Pachamama. The vulva, that sacred doorway, was the original glyph of a species becoming literate. It's a sign expressing gratitude, reverence, and awe towards the female body, with its marvelous ability to sustain and create life, and even in death to take it back as Mother Earth. Images of females dance among the pregnant animals which predominate in the caves and rock shelters used by humans in the ice ages. The female mysteries of periodicity and nature were at the center of whatever religious rites were practiced by early humans who upright walked out of Africa and journeyed east and west, eventually peopling vast continents. The first acts of human worship appear to have been in thanksgiving to the Mother of Life, inside of whose mystery we had awakened to ourselves. Clan structure developed around the mother of an extended household, who is still perceived in modern matriarchal societies such as the Moso in China or the Minangkabau in Indonesia as the central pillar of the home. At the end of the last ice age, the weather warmed over much of the planet, and our ancestors left their caves. This is the Mother Peace Empress card, some of you recognize. Many of them developed the ability to settle, grow food, and domesticate animals. Cultivation, rather than being a revolution, as was once thought, apparently unfolded in a fairly natural way from the sophisticated gathering that had already gone on for millennia. The development of agriculture marks the beginning of the Neolithic around 10,000 years ago. One important center of agriculture, the Natufian, emerged in northern Africa, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Middle East, from which it was later carried to other places, including the female-centered early civilizations of Greece and Anatolia or ancient Turkey. Archaeologists, linguists, and biologists have tracked the spread of agriculture to the Caspian Sea and along the trade routes east that would much later be known as the Silk Road. The centers of agriculture also arose, maybe independently or through diffusion, they're debating this still, in China as well as the Americas. Women are universally credited with having invented agriculture, particularly the deliberate cultivation of plants and the various complex processes associated with it, like cooking, processing, food storage, extending to basketry, pottery, and other forms of vessels, as well as granaries, allowing for a surplus of food for whole populations. The Dogon people of Mali equate the Sirius star system with their granary, seeing it as a reservoir and source of everything in the world. Egyptians called the same star Sothis, meaning to be pregnant, and represented it as the great goddess Isis. At Çatalhöyük, a 7th millennium town in ancient Turkey, I'm sure some of you have been there, an important female figure found in the granary is an enthroned woman sitting between two leopards. Ceramic vessels were crafted in the shape of the female body, emphasizing the biological functions of pregnancy and lactation, the female's concrete giving of the gift of life. Breasts on ceramic vessels used in ritual emphasize the female body, and by extension, the body of the divine female as a vessel of nourishment or renewal. The common equation of woman with hearth and home links to the evolutionary act of harnessing fire for cooking and warmth, as well as referring to the sacred nature of the hearth as altar and the woman as shaman priestess. Portable offering tables or altars, this one from Crete, have been found in burials, female burials, since the beginning of civilization, indicating the ongoing function of the sacred woman. Among several tribes, this is a quote, traditions exist that the shaman's gift was first bestowed on women. In Mongolian myths, goddesses were shamans themselves, the daughter of the moon, and the bestowers of the shamanistic gift on mankind. That's a quote. A Russian ethnographer from the early 20th century states that Neo-Siberians all have a common word for female shaman from the most ancient times, which has etymological links to the words bear, earth goddess, housewife, and wife. Among the Kamchadal in Kamchatka, there are no special shamans, she says, but every old woman, and kukchuk, which she says probably means women in men's clothes, every old woman is a witch and explains dreams. They used no drum, but simply pronounced incantations and practiced divination. Birthing, ritual ceremonies, and the baking of bread happened more or less side by side in the early Neolithic temples of northern Greece. Ovens were created in the shape of a womb with an umbilicus, and pregnant female figurines were found nearby. Evidence of bread offerings are found in most sacred sites in Europe from as early as 12,000 BCE in the Ice Age caves of France, through the Neolithic, thousands of years, and into the classical period when Dianic priestesses, witches, baked crescent-shaped cakes for the moon goddess. Today, it's the Catholic nuns who still bake the wafers for communion. And we still say she has a bun in the oven when we talk about a pregnant woman. I wrote about this in Shakti Woman. Before this altruistic and communal nature of women was colonized and exploited, it functioned for the good of the whole, and society was able to sustain itself for several thousand years in peace. Even now, remnants of these ancient practices exist all over Europe, as I witnessed recently at Lipinski Vir in Serbia, where a village man brought this freshly baked loaf of bread to show the assembled group of scholars. The bread was decorated with old European symbols of goddess and formed in the shape of a mandala, not dissimilar from those used for meditation by contemporary Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. It's a fatal error to assume, as many people do these days, that the development of agriculture itself was the beginning of private property and domination. Ancient female-based agriculture was practiced in harmony with nature and presents us with an almost utopian model of sustainability and peace on earth, compared with everything that has occurred since these civilizations were first disrupted during the 4th millennium BCE. At that time, with the introduction of male dominance, kingship, war, slavery, private property, the peaceful agricultural societies began to disappear, along with their languages, scripts, arts, and rituals. The incredibly beautiful artwork of a society like the one that predates Sumer, for example, which according to art historians has never again been equaled, was quickly replaced by mass production and the values of the bottom line, while images of women dancing and performing rituals diminish and were eventually replaced by men. Organic and biodynamic farmers today are instinctually groping their way back to what was once an intact system of complex and intelligent relatedness with all life. Our ancestors left us many images, artifacts, and physical signs of the successful continuity of culture, which they created and in which they successfully existed for several thousand years. Their central icon was the goddess, the mother of all things, whose centrality will have to be reestablished along with the women in leadership as her ministers. If progressives could begin to look at this legacy with open eyes, we could stop confusing the agribusiness of today with the agriculture of the past, of the ancient women, and instead It's a really big confusion, isn't it? And instead, we could see matriarchal agriculture for the holistic model that it was and that it is for us still today. We would then be forced to stop claiming so ignorantly that there's always been war, there'll always be war, it's the human condition, which I hear a lot in progressive settings. Perhaps this realization would give us the impetus to refuse and reject the efforts of powerful corporations like Monsanto, currently involved in dangerously altering our food at the DNA level, as well as taking out patents, private ownership on life, like we've been talking about. I recently had the good fortune to visit Lipinski Vir, this place where the man brought the bread, the oldest Neolithic site in Europe. Situated on an inaccessible terrace overlooking the Iron Gates region of the Danube, separating Romania from Serbia, the site on the Serbian side, and once facing a tumultuous whirlpool, had to be moved when the river was dammed in recent years, dating from the mid-7th to the mid-6th millennia and composed of tombs and shrines in the shape of the female body. The site was not meant for habitation, but for rites of death and regeneration. The trapezoidal, can you see that at all? It's an old archaeological picture that was in the museum at the site, and all of the shrines at the site are these interesting trapezoidal triangles, which clearly represent vulvas, the sacred pubic triangle of the goddess, and were accompanied by enigmatic rock sculptures that archaeologists have always called fish goddesses, but which are also undeniably an expression of the much later Shilanagigs found all over the British Isles. These sculptures, many of which were covered in red ochre, show a wide-eyed, entranced woman figure with legs spread and hands pointing to or opening her triangular vulva. And just as in the earlier Paleolithic period, 25,000 years ago, some of the rocks at Lipinski Vir had only a vulva incised, referring in the most abstract and refined way to the great goddess in her dual manifestation of life and death, death and rebirth. Because the human skeletons found at the site were mostly disarticulated and the skulls set aside for special care, often protected with a box of stones, it's likely that the people practiced secondary burial rites in which they, quote, laid out their dead in front of the shrines for excarnation. After the defleshing of the human bones by carrion birds, whose bones have also been found at the site, the remains were buried in the shrines. The earliest images of such sky burials are found in wall murals from Çatalhöyük, dated to the 7th millennium BCE. This is the place in central Turkey that so many of us have been interested in for such a long time. One painting shows two towers, this one, where one has the headless body placed there, and the other one, the head has been placed, with vultures approaching each. And notice one of the vultures has a double axe in her body, the earliest image of the double axe. A second painting shows vultures with human heads, human legs, and a headless corpse. Rites of excarnation or secondary burial were practiced all over Old Europe and the Mediterranean region for many millennia, and in Central Asia as well. And remnants of this practice were carried on still in some places very recently. Gimbutas documented such practices in Italy, the Near East, Anatolia, Greece, and even as far north as the Orkney Islands, where skulls were routinely buried separately and skeletons disarticulated. The famous hypogeum that we saw Elizabeth's picture yesterday in Malta, for instance, contains the remains of 7,000 human skeletons that were deposited there over a period of 1,500 years. The site was simultaneously used as a gathering place for rituals, funerary rites, but also other communal rituals, a widespread custom of ancient pre-patriarchal people, life and death, all together. Frequently, these finds, skulls and disarticulated bones, some with cut marks, have led archaeologists to conclude that cannibalism and human sacrifice were practiced. Yet in Tibet, the ancient rite of sky burial is still practiced, where a corpse is taken to a specifically designated area outside of the town or village, often at the top of a mountain, and body breakers chop the body into pieces and feed it to vultures who are considered to be incarnate dakinis. Recent films about Tibet, for instance, 7 Years in Tibet or Kundun or Himalaya, you've seen some of those films? They show graphic representations of these funerary rites, where pieces of flesh are laid out as a banquet, and the giant screaming birds come to feast ravenously on the remains. We in the West tend to view such practices with alarm. This is the Mother Peace death card, of course. We view them often as primitive, barbaric, unnatural, or gruesome. Tibetans, on the other hand, view a 3-day-old corpse as lifeless and, quote, its purposes fulfilled. The manner of disposal is considered as a final act of generosity, enabling other animals to be nourished by one's remains. This is a sort of an extended version of what we were talking about yesterday in terms of the animals and the humans and our relationship as food. This seems to me to be a remnant of the ancient matriarchal understanding of our embeddedness in nature without such a dualistic phobia of death as we have cultivated in the West. A pre-Buddhist rock painting at an important site in Tibet, sacred to the goddess Tara, shows a bird-like female identified as a Kiyung, sacred to Tibetans, and a precursor to contemporary sky women, or dakinis. Dakinis are women who fly. This harks back to, just for you, I thought as Patricia read today, this harks back to megalithic sites all over Europe where excarnation was the main burial rite. Skulls received special attention, and birds of prey were associated with the megaliths. These are pre-dynastic Egyptian. Bird goddesses and shamanistic sky-walking women are ubiquitous in the matriarchal strata in Europe and in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, suggesting a particular function of the female, widely celebrated, perhaps specializing in funerary rituals. Valkyries were corpse choosers who carried the souls of the dead off the battlefields, and Ovid described Scythian women as rubbing their bodies with flying ointments, just like the later European witches were purported to have done. Miranda Shaw reports on the cities, or the powers, of the famous yoginis who, quote, could become invisible, had mastered the ritual gazes, and had the power of fleet-footedness, the ability to traverse vast distances in a matter of minutes. The lineage of Medea of Colchis, a shaman woman or sorceress known for her regenerative magic, may continue even today in a group of mostly women and girls living in the Caucasus who are called Mesuthelae and described as sorceresses, according to a report by Janine Davis Kimball. They live among tribes considered to be descendants of Scythians and Sarmatians, and they quote, fulfill a role very similar to that of Altaic shamans, like this one, falling into trances, escorting the dead to the underworld, or reincarnating them. Shamanism, once exclusively a women's province, is a sacrificial vocation in which the shaman uses her body as a vessel for powerful energies to flow through her in order to serve her community. In the most ancient times, women performed this function collectively in ecstatic rituals and communal ceremonies involving and on behalf of the whole community. Female Buddhas and high-ranking shaman priestesses are obvious from the artifacts and images from female-centered civilizations of old Europe. This one from Crete, for example, 6000 BC. Later, during the Bronze Age, as agricultural civilizations were disrupted and scattered by violence, a special amalgam African, European, Asian shaman priestesses emerged in the Mediterranean region. They were known as Maenads. with counterparts in the Indus Valley and also in northern Tibet, China's Tarim Basin. Oh, this one's still from Greece. Sorry, this is from Chios. And here, one of the first Europoid mummies found in the Tarim Basin from 2000 BC. And this one of the three witches of Subeshi, as they're known, from 6th century BC. Designated today as merely mediums, descendants of these special women are still able to make way for powerful healing energies to inhabit and work through their bodies. Female shamans are active in the contemporary societies of Japan and Korea, as well as in isolated regions of Russia and Mongolia. This image is, I'm back to the Greek islands. The ability to become empty is what I'd like to suggest is happening here, a state of samadhi. The ability to become empty is a formal goal of meditation practice, very highly regarded in Tibetan Buddhism, and embodied by the Tibetan Dakini, or sky-going woman, whose selflessness is said to be, quote, compatible with activity in the world with or for the sake of others. This is like the Buddhist concept of the bodhisattva. You take a vow. It's one who incarnates for the well-being of others. In other words, one whose birth is a gift to sentient beings. The wisdom Dakini is described as being fully awakened and acts to awaken others. Oh, pretty hard to see? That's a Dakini, statue of a Dakini. The medicine Buddha has a female precursor in Tibet, a pre-Buddhist group of Tibetan female deities who often form sisterhoods, described as no longer popular and nearly extinct in the region. The Tibetan name, Man, pertaining to both medicine and women, is defined as benefit or beneficence. It's also an honorific term for women in general. Scholar John Vincent Bellezza says that women and the Man share the same qualities, and Man also came to mean medicine by virtue of its connection with the feminine qualities of nurturer and healer. The female Manmo, which would be a demoness today, meaning benefactress, predates the later Manpa, or male doctor. Bellezza also states in general that although the appearance, theology, and culture of the great goddess could be altered, she was never eliminated. And although this mostly goes unrecognized, Dakinis are also believed to take human form as women. So any woman could potentially be acting as a Dakini at any time. As Simmer Brown puts in her new book, Dakini's Warm Breath, human women are the display that emptiness takes when it expresses itself in form. I call this the absent referent in Tibetan Buddhism. I'm working on a book to put the woman back into Tibetan Buddhism. She's referred to constantly. Today, Dakinis and yoginis are treated mainly as abstract deities or yidams in the texts, interiorized into Indian and Tantric Tibetan Buddhist visualization practices. Nonetheless, their historical reality is strongly attested to. Bellezza mentions Chinese references to Eastern and Western kingdoms of women, where women held dominant social and political roles in the autocracy and authority that was matrifocal. The area to the immediate west of Tibet was once known as Odiyana, the land of the Dakinis. And Jujum Rinpoche, a High Lama and head of the Nyingma lineage, is quoted as saying in the 20th century that the women of the region belong to an ancient race of Dakinis and still have the power over the arts of magic, gaze, transformation of objects by means of certain Gnostic spells, and some minor sorcery. In India, the so-called cult of the yoginis, this is a yogini temple from North India from the 8th century, embodied many of these same concepts. The yoginis, known also as matrikas, or circles of mothers, were famous for their 8 cities, or supernatural powers. They represent an ancient lineage going back to the Indus Valley in Central Asia, continuing in some form to the present day in such self-proclaimed Devis or shaman women as Amachi. Much of my research over the last decade has been to document the unbroken lineage of female shamanism across Afro-Eurasia, from ancient times to the present. The continuity of practices, rituals, and artifacts identifying the sacred women who have functioned as religious leaders in their communities all across the Silk Road for thousands of years was a main theme in my new book, The Double Goddess, Women Sharing Power. This is Greece, of course. In the book, I show direct links between Egypt, Africa, the Greek Maenads, Central Asian Amazons, Indo-Tibetan Dakinis and Yoginis, and European witches. All of them were known for their ability to fly through the air, heal the sick, resurrect the dead, brew sacred, intoxicating, fermented beverages like soma, and perform sexual and divination practices for which they have been misunderstood, maligned, peripheralized, and demonized in the modern world. A timely example of this negative bias is a Russian article describing a rich female burial recently excavated in the Crimea. That's like on the Black Sea, you know where that is. The Sarmatian woman who died in her mid-40s was buried with symbols of great wealth or rank, including her, quote, lavish dress, massive golden earrings decorated with garnets, golden necklace, and golden medals sewn to her dress. But it was the so-called occult inventory, 9 bronze rings, the same number of bells, and a whole array of different amulets and beads buried with her, that caused the archaeologists to jump to the incredible conclusion that she must have been a witch in the pejorative sense. Because, quote, all the relics date back to a much earlier period than the woman's corpse. He is quoted as saying, the witch must have dug out those accessories from ancient burials in order to intensify her magical practices. Isn't that amazing, her magical powers? This is this is the unbiased scholarly research that comes out of the academy. In actual fact, heirloom artifacts are commonly found in important female burials from all over the ancient world, and for a long period of time, especially during the Bronze and Iron Ages when they were on the run. They were trying to keep their thing going, and they were migrating like crazy, and I wrote a lot about that in The Double Goddess. I think that's who the Amazons are. And these heirlooms were most likely passed down as cult items from one priestess in the lineage to the next. The shift from a gift economy to a commodity culture can be seen in the transition that occurred from matriarchal cultures to patriarchal ones everywhere, almost everywhere. Under patriarchy, shaman priestesses became witches, ogresses, demonesses, this is all in the literature, sacred harlots, temple prostitutes, and what was once freely given became a commodity controlled by male authorities in male-dominant social structures. Most recently, this shift occurred in India, where the Devadasis, the temple dancers, were still, until the 1950s, giving the gift of their bodies by dancing for the deity in the temples, cooking food in the temples to be shared communally with the worshipers in attendance, and performing the sacred sexual rites to benefit all beings. Because the British conceived of them as prostitutes, the Devadasis were outlawed and forced to stop practicing their ancient rites. This outlawing of the ancient female tradition of gift-giving coincides with the further colonization of women seen in the catastrophic rise of sex work and the female sexual slavery found around the world since then. Thank you.
want to, it's all before me, to thank Jen for the opportunity to be here and to be challenged by the many issues and ideas and conceptions that are being presented, from the theory of the gift economy to its concrete expression throughout history and society. For someone like me, whose time is spent in the practical terms of the construction of social movements, for the creation of a world in which institutions will support the development of the human potential by protecting, promoting, defending, and practicing that all human beings are equal in rights and in dignity. For someone who spends most of the time here, looking and spending a few days reflecting on the different theoretical constructs of how we interpret that practice is an important part of what long-term activists have known as a relationship between theory and practice. And others before me have spent much time thinking about what that relationship is. And certainly as a norm that guides my political work and the work that we do in the construction of these movements is that there is a relationship between theory and practice. Theory gives us direction, and practice gives us the movement. And it is the learning from theory that enables us to actually move these movements in their construction and in their development in a way that will benefit people. But it also, the practice, when you look at it, retroalimenta in Spanish, or gives back and feeds theoretical development. So for me, it was interesting that to look at the immigrant rights movement, to look at the human rights movement, to look at the communities where I work, and to try to understand what this theory of a gift economy is in its practical expression. And certainly one of the most important aspects of the restructuring and integration of the global economy right now is the role of the human right to mobility. And this role is an important part because it talks about how this economy is being integrated. It is about the interdependence of social, economic, and political relationships in the human family. And so human mobility in the current phase, being restructured by economic and political elites worldwide, conditions the way people live within countries as well as those that attempt to move across countries. The wealth created has enabled, more than ever before in human history, the technology, the communications, and the ability to move easily across borders, a historical experience recreated within the configuration of civilizations and countries throughout the globe. But that increased capacity, given the current strategy of economic global development, has made mobility safely and legally across borders a right for only a very few, the global economic and political elites. That mobility is easily seen when we see the movement of CEOs of corporations all over the world, the meeting of political elites without any problem safely and legally across borders to also discuss issues of global dominance and exploitation and control, but also of those called refugees, the Marcoses of Philippines, the Salinas de Gortaris of Mexico, and all others who are considered the wealthy refugees. All of these sectors move legally and safely across the world without any problems, so that their role is sustained and maintained in the recreation and construction of this globalization from above. And so when we look at the development of immigration policy in nation states throughout the world, and how these defined who is allowed to enter, who is allowed to stay, who is allowed to become a member of the nation state, it becomes very clear that immigration policy and border enforcement policy is about the restriction of mobility of the international working poor and the internationally displaced who are poor. Borders, barriers, border agents, and militarized institutional violence to restrict mobility are part of the mechanisms to reinforce social, political, gender inequalities on a global scale of the very few against the very many. Institutional violence is necessary to sustain these inequities. And so those that must sustain it, like any other type of human activity, will define the movement across the border without government inspection as a crime. A crime that has no violence and has no victim, but that permits the construction of institutions both internally and externally that ensure that the strategy of economic development of those elites persist. And that strategy is of the creation of high profits and low wages. It is a mechanism that also assists in the implementation of the structural adjustment policies of a scorched earth policy that forces a building of havens for speculative capital investment circles while curtailing investments in social infrastructure and in human development. It is policies that then force millions to opt for the incorporation into a global labor market, their only option for survival. And so the movement of people become an important aspect of challenging the very policies that wants to restrict its conditions according to the plans of increasing profits. So when communities faced with structural adjustment policies of scarcity and families opt to move to another country, these decisions are made by families in consultations of who must migrate and who must stay. They are made in the context of communities that have traditions of moving across international borders and have established networks that both receive them in those countries and who help them to move through the borders and who then help them to sustain the families and communities in the countries of origin. The decision in that sense is a decision made by families to regenerate their survival, forming strong emotional bonds that will respond to the needs, the fundamental basic needs to sustain their development as families and as humans. And yet it is this very act, this timeless transnational networks that operate in the context of exploitation and policies of plundering countries of origin that actually form the networks of resistance and rebellions to the known or design of the powerful economic elites. The family networks facilitate migration. The family networks facilitate reinstatement of community needs. And family networks allow the instant conveying of resources, information, and even affection. It's interesting to note the growth in the use of, for instance, cell phones in communities of origins and receptions. There are even communities who install computers in the community so that families can then see each other from from places, for instance, as far as New York, to places in small, tiny villages in the state of Michoacan in Mexico or in Ecuador. So in the current global configuration, the movement of people as a strategy of survival, I have learned from last night's talk, is actually a strategy of thrival. And this strategy of thrival is based on living an economy of giving that sustains economic prosperity and interconnections between people moving north and resources coming south in the midst of an ecosystem and a global configuration that threatens the very sustainability of communities, economies, and particularly the development of human beings. So when I analyzed the phenomena, I said, my God, there is a gift economy in this process of transnationalization of movements, communities. And what is that gift? According to a great deal of interest now by many powerful institutions and studies and surveys, it's been discovered that of the people who live outside of their countries of origin, $100 billion move globally every year between the so-called developed countries and the developing countries due to the money sent back by millions and millions of immigrants worldwide. 30 billion of those dollars go to Latin America, 15 billion, half of that, to Mexico. And then there are many, many unrecorded gifts in resources by communities. It is considered again by these surveys that half of the unrecorded and the free labor given to this development has actually out-edged net direct foreign investment in countries of origin. As I often propose to Mexican immigrants, we might as well form a co-op and buy Mexico. So what is the gift? The gift is $190 at least sent back to families 7 times per year. In some cases it is 100, in some cases it is 300. In some cases, immigrants will send back 15% of each paycheck, and others will send 50% of each paycheck. So the range is 15 to 15% of salaries in labor markets of exploitation that go back to sustain families. Who receives? Well, let's talk about the senders first. Who sends these? Who are the senders? They tend to be migrants, as I said, selected, agreed to by the consensus of families, to move to seek economic opportunity. They are the socially excluded, who transformed the experience of migrations as an experience of liberation for themselves and for their communities. If we look at Latin America, some 6 million immigrants send money back home on a regular basis. 6 million sent $30 billion. Of these, 1/2 have been in the US for less than 10 years. Who are the senders? There's a national employment survey that was done in Mexico and found out that out of 5,896 individuals who migrated to the United States between 1997 and 2002, 70% had sent money back home. 89% were men. 60% are less than 30 years old. 48% were of homes that also had senders of money. And 79% of these are people who entered the United States without documents. It is considered that 2/3 of the senders have been in the United States less than 10 years, and they send money once a month. When you look at migrants that have been in the United States less than 5 years, 3/4 send once per month. And so when we look at the income range of the senders in the United States, we find that people who earn $50,000 or more a year send 9%. This is they're talking about Mexico. 9% are the ones who send money back home. Of the people who earn $30,000 to $50,000 a year, 32% of these send money back home. And of people who earn less than $30,000, 46% of these send money back home. So in effect, 78% of the $15 billion sent back to Mexico are sent back by people who earn less than $50,000 a year and who spend 15 to 50% of their check to send back to relatives in Mexico. Who receives is the question. In Mexico, 18% of the adult population. Who receives? The majority are women. What impact? How many households? 4.4% of the household in Mexico, or 4.3 million people, receive these gifts. 40% of those receiving them depend on them to sustain themselves and not to slip into dire poverty. 3 to 4 people per household benefit from spending. And 73.6% of the recipients are under the age of 15 and over the age of 65. So what does this tells us? That as a family consultation strategy and method of survival, people decide which family migrates. And while the majority are men, 40% of those who do migrate are women. And they support brothers and sisters, not necessarily just parents. Yet when we look at who receives, and we see that the majority of the recipients are women, the decisions of how to use these $15 billion in the country of origin, in this case Mexico, are decisions of women. And they are decisions to sustain households. And what is the impact on these households? Without this gift from the people who have left, it would be impossible to sustain these families. They become the government welfare program without having the government involved. And without having the government involved, they go directly to the people in need, to those to whom it is critical to survive. And the fund keeps a large number of working class families from dropping into poverty, and the elderly and the children particularly taken care of. Families that receive these gifts are more likely to send children to schools, have access to health care, and likely to start a small business. The funds, as said, tend to be directed toward the caring, the giving of that family unity, the children. The function of the mother model of the economy that Genevieve put forward in her theory. But in this case, acting as a family unit. Then you have collective gift giving. Collective gift giving is the coming together of communities who are, for instance, in the case of Mexico and the United States, into what are called clubs of the originating city where they are from. Some people call them hometown associations. They have existed with other migrant groups. There are hometown associations for Jewish immigrants, for Irish immigrants, for the immigrant experience in general. In the case of Mexico, these constitute probably the people who send the remittances that according to many sources now say, are really not taken into account by any financial institution, because these gifts are not transferred through banks, but are taken by communities directly through the clubes and their representatives. These tend to be immigrants who have settled longer within the United States, but who sustain a large number of new immigrants every year. The clubes, or hometown associations, are volunteer, structurally organized collective entities that consult with the community where they're from to decide on how to spend time in terms of projects and mutual obligations to the well-being of the town. Some of these are in response to crises, such as a natural disaster, but others are a continual and developed interchange between the hometown and the hometown association in the United States, or the clubes. And what do? Well, they collect money through simple activities such as rodeos and bake sales and very grassroots type of activities. And they both invest in the community, but they also send goods. There's a transfer of certain goods that they will buy in the United States and then transfer to the countries, to the communities. Things such as ambulances, medical equipment, school buses and supplies, machinery for the development of the town well, equipment that may lead to the construction of a particular hospital. They invest in social projects, scholarships for people in the town, health clinics, child care facilities, home for the elderly. And they even invest in job creations, some vocational schools to permit the youth to have skills to be able to operate in the economy. How many of these are there? We really don't know. There's a calculation. There are probably 630 US cities, 218 in LA alone. They also form state federations. Some of the strongest are la Federación del Sur, de Clubes del Sur de California, the Federation of Clubs of Southern California. There's the Federation of Clubes of the state of Michoacán. And there's the Federation of Clubes de Jalisco of different states. And how do they collect the resources and the monies to be able to invest in the towns? It's through membership dues. It's through quotas. It's through fundraising activities, donations, and sometimes in the case of the oldest and strongest, like the Federación de Clubes del Sur de California, they even enter into arrangements with local and state governments. Some of them have even entered into arrangements with the Nat Bank in order to create pools of resources to increase their communities. I'll give you some examples. The Federation of Clubes de Zacatecas in 1995 convinced the governor of the state that if they invested $1, the municipal government should invest $1 and the state government should invest in another dollar. And so was created the program known as Dos por Uno, 2 for 1. And so among the Federation clubs, they gathered $600,000 and they took to Zacatecas with the investment of municipal and state governments, were able to fund 56 projects in 34 towns. 4 of hometown associations of the state of Michoacán and Illinois raised $650,000 for projects in their localities about the same time as well. But then you have concrete examples of the individual clubs. There are 100 families in Anaheim, California. They have a club called El Club Tamastitian. And they basically organize around health projects for the town because there is a sanctuary in the town called El Señor de los Reyes. And many people throughout Mexico come to be healed. And what the town people observed was that as these people came to be healed by the spiritual healing of El Señor de los Reyes, they would enter into health crises, and there was no infrastructure to take care of the sick. And so they've invested in building a house so that medical schools around Mexico can send student doctors to practice and train in the town. They bought surgical equipment, and they've installed a water pump to assist the clinics of the area. You have another example like Club Pesqueros, who basically, one of the persons there died because there was no ambulance. And so families of Pesqueros, Jalisco joined together and bought the ambulance. Now they have a fund to support, to give scholarships for middle and high school students, again, a strategy to prevent dropouts, and support 57 children with developmental problems. And every year, one of their fundraising activities here in the States is to have a banquet, a baile, and a rodeo. And there is a reina of the Club Pesqueros, a queen of the Club Pesqueros. But this is the young woman, not the most beautiful young woman, but the one that can raise the most funds to go to the collective fund for the work in the town. So after hearing all the discussions here, I was thinking of suggesting to the Club Pesquero, they call her the goddess of gift giving. And so these examples are examples then of community. The poorest of the poor on the international global scale, the most exploited, the women you see cleaning our rooms, the people cutting our lawns, the people working in the restaurants, these are the ones who are gift giving of their, despite the conditions of exploitation. What are the impacts? Well, there are within many spheres that say, well, these are not good investments. It might be $15 billion, but it's not a good way of investing. Why? Because they don't invest in productive projects. They don't invest in capital-making projects. They simply support families. And so it's a very interesting discussion because it goes to the heart of some of the theories put forth in the gift economy of how the sustaining of families to develop and the sustaining of communities, like the infrastructure projects that many of these clubes have undertaken, are not considered a valuable, from the capitalist point of view, a valuable form of gift giving to the community. And so suddenly one day I was reading and I saw a paper by John B. Taylor, the Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, give a presentation, and he states, in my remarks, I would like to discuss, number one, why Bush administration cares so much about remittances. Why the Bush administration cares so much about remittances. That is, as the capitalist financial establishment and corporations began to understand the volume of gift giving being sent back by individuals and communities, the question then became, how do we take advantage of it? How does this gift giving contribute to our own interests and developments? And so now the Federal Reserve Bank needs to figure out how to get easy wire transfers between immigrant communities and countries of origin. Immigrant communities faced with increasing ability to move because of tougher border enforcement measures and the lack of programs to legalize their status, find it much more difficult to move what was once transfers done by family members and persons back to the communities. So the financial institutions are positioning themselves to see which can offer the better program and at the same time charge for the transfer of these. It is considered that even a 1% cost of transfers, or a lowering of cost of transfers that is now in many cases done by Western Union or MoneyGram, could actually contribute $1 billion more to sustain families in the countries of origin. There's the other interest by governments. The Fox administration particularly, it's interesting how he has created this concept of congratulating the people in the United States for what now has become the largest source of foreign exchange to Mexico, beyond petroleum, beyond tourism. And again, like in other countries, has edged the net direct capitalist contribution in foreign investment in Mexico. The Fox administration has developed several government programs so that these funds are invested in productive projects, which again mean profit-making projects. There was one of his administration people who in a public speech said, our economy is doing great, we have had so much success in oil, in trade, and by the way, in remittances sent by the paisanos, as if they had anything to do with the earning of these in the country of origin and then the sending back. But certainly they are being seen by the capitalist establishment as a mind goal that had become and was invisible as the gift giving should be, and only recognized by those that received it and the communities who basically had the experience of the projects that were brought forth by the many clubes that exist in the United States. And so that brought the practice, this is the practice, the movement of people, the sending of money, that has an impact. The very small ant-like savings have a tremendous aggregate effect upon the economies that are being sent. It is interesting to me to note that when it's been done with the sophisticated analysis that economists can now do of what is called matrices of I don't know what things that economists do, that there have been a certain analysis that even those micro gifts that become aggregate sums have a tremendous impact on the well-being of the economy, such as the Mexican economy. For instance, in a study done by one of those economists, showed that just the injection of $2 billion as a result of remittances increased the output of production in Mexico by $4 billion. And increased income in Mexico to approximately 2.2% of total income, with the results of the creation of 325,225 potential jobs. In other words, there can be one job created for every $4,400 of the money sent back home by immigrants. So there is a definite impact on economies and the well-being, and the capitalists ready now to capitalize. So when I look at the issue of gift giving and where progressive movements are in their theoretical development of such experiences, what we see is that while we can conceptualize that the experience of gift giving comes from homes that send, come from decisions of consensus, come from decisions in which men and women decide who migrates and who makes the decisions of how to invest when that money is seen. They can have those values, which are the values of mothering, nurturing, and giving, are meaningless unless they're infused with the experience of those who are exploited and oppressed. Because that gives us the direction. It is the difference between the mothering and the nurturing described by the cardinal in Rome that characterizes women, and the nurturing and caring that is being done by immigrants all over the world to their families and the commission, which is a direct result of the experience of exploitation and oppression. And how to resist, how to construct communities, how to really live in the practical terms, a globalization from below.